Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. Our guest today is on a mission to preserve, protect, and defend the long-suffering liberal arts, doing so with gusto and unmistakable passion for his cause, whether in intellectual history seminars or in his Coursera online offering. Wesleyan University President Michael Roth, a professor of history and humanities, grapples with the history and future of American higher learning in his new book, Beyond the University: Why Liberal Education Matters. In his brief but most intellectually energizing book, which spans American discourse on democracy and education from Thomas Jefferson to John Dewey, Roth argues that liberal education fosters both critical thinking and values essential for American survival. At commencement this year, he told the class of 2014, "Liberal learning doesn't only steep us in a tradition that is our national, ethnic, or racial identity. It challenges us to find ways to acknowledge practices that we otherwise would have ignored." Roth added that their liberal education will help these graduates to overcome blindness, to detect value, which is fundamental for innovation as well as for empathy. Our guest's words. So as this year's graduates quite literally go beyond the university, I want to ask President Michael Roth of Wesleyan University how he infuses this humanitarian vision into his blueprint for the future of liberal education, and what obstacles in modern American culture most stand in his way. President Roth?
Well, it's so nice to be here, Alexander. Well, the obstacles are the ones that have been part of American culture for a long time. People worry about making a living, as well they should. You know, it used to be the liberal arts tradition in Europe was really geared for people who were not going to have to work. The idea was that you were free, and that meant you had a life of leisure for many people. In American history, it's been quite different. Liberal learning has been seen as a vehicle for democratic citizenship and for an active life, either in commerce or in science, industry, the arts. So way back when Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin were arguing about education and the early days of the Republic, they saw a broad contextual education as the key to creating free citizens who were active, people who could do things in the world. And so today, as there has been throughout American history, there are people who say, gosh, we need to do things really quickly in the world. We have to get things done tomorrow or yesterday. And so they think a broad contextual education is luxurious, wasteful, somehow not efficient enough. But these guys, I think actually, as they were in the early 1800s, they're missing the forest for the trees. They're trying to train us for a job they imagine is in existence this morning, but not for a lifetime of creative work over many, many years. Just this morning I was reading in the newspaper about a plan that Udacity is hatching to have what they call nano degrees. So you just learn one thing. You learn how to code. Learn how to code. You can go right into AT&T and be a coder. And when the code changes, you're out of luck, my friend. And this is the same thing that Jefferson worried about. This is the same thing that Franklin worried about, or that Jane Addams and Du Bois worried about. We need an education that prepares you for an active life, not making believe you're going to be an intellectual sitting on a sofa somewhere and just thinking grand thoughts. Prepares you for an active life, but prepares you in such a way that you continue to learn, continue to innovate.
So hone in on, for our viewers, you talk about humanistic frameworks. What does that mean?
Well, a humanistic framework is what I sometimes call a contextual framework. That is, when you're studying something, let's say you're studying engineering, you can learn how to build a bridge, and Lord knows if you're building a bridge, you want it to stand up, right? We don't want it to be clunky. We don't want it to fall down under weight that you didn't expect it couldn't support. We want you to have those technical skills to make that bridge work. But if you have a broad contextual education in addition to the skills, you also have the ability to understand where that bridge should go. What neighborhoods will it disrupt if you put it in one place rather than another? How will it affect commerce over time? How will it affect the environment over time? What kind of design should it have? Do you want a really ugly, sturdy bridge, or do you want a sturdy bridge that actually it creates a sense of pleasure as you're crossing it, like the New Bay Bridge, let's say, in San Francisco, where I was last week? So a A technical education is important. I mean, we want people to make a bridge that holds, that holds the weight, but we want people to also imagine all the things that connect to building that bridge, all the things that connect to the culture, society, and environment in which that bridge will be inserted.
And those questions warrant critical thinking.
They do. Critical thinking is really important so that, well, basically you're not fooled. You know, we're here in New York. If somebody says to you, hey, I got a bridge for you, right? Over in New Jersey, you know, for you, I'm going to give you a special deal. You want to be able to think about it critically enough to know that this is too good to be true, as my father used to say, right? Beware when these guys come along with this great deal for you. It's too good to be true. So there's critical thinking in that sense, to be able to see through a bad argument, to see through a lie, to understand when someone is doing one thing but actually under that under that disguise is doing lots of other things. Critical thinking is absolutely key in science, in the humanities, in the arts. But as you know from my book, I also talk about the limits of critical thinking. Because one of the great virtues of a liberal education is not just being able to see how somebody else is fooling you, it's also being able to see opportunities where other people don't see it, to see possibility, and not just to be able to critique.
So in that sense, at Wesleyan, you really believe in the virtue of progressive values. How do you avoid liberal education, as you describe it in your book, from being politicized to the point that it becomes demonized?
Yeah, well, you know, this is a good season for that question, because we've just had the embarrassing episodes at these different colleges and universities about commencement speakers being canceled, you know, and the specter of political correctness, you know, raises its head, and rightly so. I mean, some of these I think were really sad commentaries on the inability of so-called liberal education institutions to tolerate people of different viewpoints. So what I mean by a liberal education isn't political liberalism. It's open-mindedness, it's ability to understand context, it's critical thinking and opportunities seeking. But that happens not only on the left, let's say, among liberals of the political persuasion, but it also can happen on the right. And so one of the most important things I can do at Wesleyan, for example, is not just to promote the progressive values of diversity in regard to race, ethnicity, and social class, sexual orientation. All of those things are really important. But I also think political diversity is really important. And so if Wesleyan is just filled with people on the left, like many colleges and universities, then you get this echo chamber of thinking, which is antithetical to education. So I want to make sure in our curriculum at Wesleyan, and I hope this is true at other schools as well, we have representation from other points of view, from conservative points of view, from religious points of view. In my survey course of great books, or sometimes I say good enough books in the modern and the postmodern, I wind up having to spend a lot of time with my students explaining to them what religious orientation means and how it infuses certain of the most important philosophical concepts with which they're grappling. Because most of these young men and women are pretty secular. And so it falls on me sometimes, who myself a secular Jew, to really describe with as much gusto as I can the religious fervor that made these ideas so compelling to people, let's say, in the 19th century. Political diversity is important for progressive liberal arts institutions today. Political diversity means that you have to have conservative voices also on campus.
But political diversity, as you point out, is embraced on your campus, is embraced among the small Ivies and all campuses of your caliber, but yet folks don't make the distinction between liberalism as a political identity and liberal education, and that's a tough line.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, I think, and some people said to me, you know, don't call it why liberal education matters, use liberal arts because it seems less political. I use the phrase liberal education because it's this great old American phrase. I mean, Jefferson and Franklin talk about it. And it is true that these people were progressive in their time, but there are also figures who insist that a liberal education must preserve the great works of the past. That's a fundamentally conservative position too, right? Not that you have to memorize things from the past, but you should be grappling with some of the work that has animated some of the best thinkers in the past. In the end, you may decide, okay, that's not for me. But I think the dismissive attitude towards historical greatness is a handicap for our students today. And I've written about this in an op-ed not long ago, where I think some of my students are so good at critical thinking that when it comes to reading, I don't know, Rousseau or Kant, they quickly say, well, I think he's wrong, or I think this person is wrong. And I always say to them, you know, that's okay. I don't really care what you think right now. I want you to tell me why you think Rousseau said this, or why you think Virginia Woolf wrote this way. Get in her shoes. Think from her point of view. And later you can decide what you think. But right now, let's with some sense of criticism, but also respect, think about the great works of the past. I do think that's part of liberal education, and it's also a conservative perspective.
Is that the most persuasive argument to those who would criticize liberal education? To embrace the texts as they were conceived? To challenge them, but also to understand the period in which they were written?
Yes, challenge them and understand the period in which they were written. That's a great combination, and I think that rather than insisting on some orthodoxy of progressivism or some orthodoxy of liberalism, what we want to do is be counter-orthodox. We want to have our students learn to think for themselves. But I want to make clear that I don't see the political attacks as being the most important issue right now for liberal education. I think the rush to vocationalism is much more important. And these are some of the so-called progressive folks who say, well, we don't really need colleges, we don't really need universities, what we really need is training. And as John Dewey said long ago, that's a prescription for keeping people in their place, a prescription for keeping people in their own little track. They don't learn enough to have the possibility of advancing. And in America today, where inequality is perhaps the most fundamental social problem we have, not giving people an education that opens doors for them is handicapping them and keeping them in the lower ranks of society.
I'm glad you mentioned inequality because it's from your book you draw attention to the hypocrisy embedded in the American tradition in the sense that Thomas Jefferson embraced the idea of education as a great equalizer to embrace liberty and liberation, and yet he was a slave owner. And it seems like in this society where we have the haves and the have-nots, we continue to be in this mire or muck or both of inequity.
Yeah.
How does the idea of liberal arts or a liberal education combat that?
Well, it's a great question. You know, Jefferson is, for me, such a fascinating figure because, as you say, he has these very progressive ideas about rejuvenating the country and getting rid of the unnatural aristocracy of wealth, as he said, you know, against the tyranny of oppressive governments. You know, lots of things that resonate today. But at the same time, he has all these blind spots that some of them lots of people had at his time, and he had a few extra. But what I found so interesting in reading Jefferson and then reading David Walker or Frederick Douglass or W.B. Du Bois or Jane Addams, who were writing as Africans or African Americans or women who would not have, Jefferson wouldn't have been sympathetic to them. They take the Jeffersonian vision and extend it beyond where he had it. They take an American tradition and move it beyond its hypocritical origins. And this is what Dick Rorty used to say, you know, America is this unachieved aspiration. But the aspiration is really important to hold on to. We must recognize the hypocrisy, to be sure, but we don't want to lose the aspiration for fairness and progressive equality. That aspiration, I think, is really an important part of education, and it's really an important part of American democracy.
But in a universe that is very much still a 99% versus a 1%, why are we not destined to remain as such?
Education is the answer, my friend. I mean, I do think that if we can improve our education systems, it is the best chance for changing the destiny of poor people, of people who have been discriminated against because of race or ethnicity or sexual orientation. That education is a vehicle for people to expand their cultural horizons and change their economic horizons. Now, it could be the opposite, and it often is today. I understand that. In this new film, Ivory Tower, Andrew Rossi, in the documentarian, he really emphasizes that we have too much loans, we have too much debt for students, that we're cementing privilege with education. But the aspiration of Franklin, Jefferson, and Du Bois was that education could actually be the ways through which you open doors that change your life. And if we can do that by not condemning people who live in poor neighborhoods to have poor schools, if we can do that by having universities like Wesleyan and other highly selective places open their doors for people regardless of their ability to pay, then I think we have a chance to not fall into a pattern of just the 1% and the 99%.
But those founders did not convey or appreciate the possibility of the condemnation of education.
Yes, that is true. I mean, I do think they had their debates about education. You know, Franklin, he hated the Ivies, or the, Harvard, I should say. There was no Ivies then, but, he said that you go up to Cambridge and you learn how to walk out of a drawing room backwards, and it's all about, education. In the bad education for Franklin was the one that made you into a snob, right? Just means you could cite different quotations and act like a jerk. But he wanted a true education, not just training. And today I think I am disturbed by the fact that so many people seem to focus on the most narrow form of training for immediate economic payoff. But that, we're going to become just a call center for the rest of the world if that happens. We'll just be trained to do somebody else's job. When I sent the copy of the book to the head of human resources at Google, and to my great surprise, because, a pretty technical company, he wrote back and said, here we believe in liberal education is the foundation for creative work. And I think that's the secret for American ingenuity and creativity, is an education that gives you the power to be productive and surprising at the same time, and not just productive and staying in your niche.
Productive and surprising, that's one hell of a mantra.
That's pretty good. I think, well, thank you, because I didn't come up with that until this moment.
You refer to, implicitly, the brain drain of talented young people who either lack an interest in contributing to the sphere of humanistic influence. And so many of the talented, bright young people today are being drained into finance or consulting, as opposed to realms where they can immediately have an impact on a grassroots level.
Yeah, I think
maybe not at Wesleyan.
It's hard to
but it's a global
generalize.
phenomenon,
Yeah.
and that is connected to your concern about the niche education.
That's right. I think people who willfully embrace a narrowing of their horizons are destined for that, what's it called, the quiet life, of the quiet desperation, right? This of living a life that's not self-reliant. I spend a lot of time with Emerson in this book. But I do think you can approach any field, you can approach any work with the spirit of liberal education. I don't think you have to kind of do a certain kind of job to show you're using your education well. I've spoken with consultants here in New York and elsewhere who are among the most thoughtful people I've talked with about things. I mean, they see things from 100 different angles, and they are thinking about things very broadly, contextually, and conceptually. And so, I'm ecumenical about the kind of job you wind up doing or the kind of subject you study. What I want people to understand is that narrowing into your subject instead of looking at your subject from a variety of perspectives in the long run will be unhelpful. So I do worry when we see folks entering the colleges or universities of our country who don't have their curiosity stimulated, who don't have themselves provoked to think. I think that's a problem, but that's probably also a problem of teaching too. I mean, I think great teachers can awaken people. I mean, Emerson says it, right? Great teachers make you animate the world. And and you've seen this probably yourself when you're in a classroom with a really great teacher, you start noticing things around you. You start paying attention to things that you hadn't even realized were there before. And I think that can happen. I'm very enthusiastic. I teach every semester. I'm very enthusiastic about the ability of young people to suddenly turn it on and say, gosh, I can think for myself.
Well, you say that the healthiest byproduct of a liberal education is optimism.
It is. I think you have to have a certain amount of hope in order to pursue education. I mean, if you're a pessimist, well, why bother learning more, right? It's all you're going to feel worse because you'll be smarter. But I think education gives rise to a kind of hope tempered by knowledge of the past and knowledge and experience. It's not naivete that you get through education. But I do think education is linked to a belief in the possibility of progress. Jefferson and Franklin were Enlightenment people. Whatever we think of the post-Enlightenment culture we're in, I think that if you are going to expand your intellectual and cultural horizons, if you're going to work towards greater social mobility, then you are committed to the possibility of progress. And that commitment, I think, is important for educators.
Is the democratization of education imperative in building that path to social mobility?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think, I was in California right when this decision came out about not having tenure for public school teachers. California has a very bizarre system where you have to get tenure after 2 years, and there's many reforms are needed there. But the fundamental thing they're missing, and Diane Ravitch pointed this out recently, as she has many times before, the fundamental thing they're missing in that decision is that poverty is what makes schools ineffective. And that when we cure poverty, when we address the connection between poor neighborhoods and poor schools, we give students in those areas the ability to change their lives. At Wesleyan, we have hundreds and hundreds of students who are working as volunteers in the local school district. What we are now doing, and we're working with the Obama administration on this, is to make sure that their efforts at working in public schools lead to greater college readiness. Because if students from modest backgrounds or poor backgrounds actually are prepared to go to college, either a 2-year or 4-year college, and they get a degree from either 2-year or 4-year school, their chances for economic mobility are dramatically increased. We know that education, successful education, that is one that ends in a diploma or a certificate of some kind, is a great tool, the best tool for social mobility.
Why don't you explain to our viewers the nature of Coursera and your involvement with it, because virtual learning by you and others is considered perhaps the most effective form of democratizing education.
Well, we're in the middle of our Coursera experiment, and I'm as you know, I'm very much involved with it myself. I have a class that's starting this week, the first day of the summer, June 21st, called How to Change the World. It's a 7-week course that looks at different global issues and what we can do in response to them. And I did this with the 92nd Street Y and Mashable and a bunch of other foundations. And what we've at Wesleyan, we're a small school. We have 3,000 students roughly. In the last year and a half, we've had almost 700,000 students enroll through Coursera. Coursera is a platform through which you can enroll in college-level classes for free. Most of our students, they've had 7 million on Coursera in 2 years, 7 million enrolled, and many of them, enroll and then go on to something else. They don't stick with it, but many of them do. Millions have, and they get a free education. Now, the problem with this method so far is that it is least effective with people we might think need it the most. That is, people who have no college experience, people who have struggled in high school, will struggle with online education.
Is that because of the digital divide?
It's the digital divide, and also I think it's just self-motivated, focused people do well with the online courses. People who need more assistance, they give up with online courses. You need real teachers to help you learn. Now, real teachers may work online effectively, but I think it's a panacea to think that you can simply put in a massive course and solve all our problems. We're experimenting with it because we think if we can get these courses to be better, stronger, that is more compelling for more kinds of students, then we will democratize education. But I think the most effective way we know of helping students learn is by having a really good professor work with them.
We're running out of time, but let me ask you then, what about a hybrid model where you start through Coursera, assuming you have the basic equipment to take that class, and then people in the surrounding area in Middletown or elsewhere in Connecticut in the tri-state area can come and sit in on a course with you?
Absolutely. I think that I have this class, How to Change the World, was used in Israeli high school, in a school of public health in Texas, and Korean Women's University. They used it as a textbook. They worked with other teachers. They didn't need to sit with me. They could use this course, my course, as part of their education. And I think that hybrid model is going to be the key. Students will come to places like Wesleyan and other universities having done work online. They'll be able to get through more quickly, perhaps less expensively. I mean, I do think education is changing. Innovations in education will make it available to more people. It should make education more affordable, but we must keep it broad, we must keep it contextual so that students learn to learn, which means they will continue to learn beyond the university.
Well, I think this conversation proves that the presence of a teacher, a mentor, is definitely indispensable.
Well, thank you.
And I want to thank you, Michael Roth, for being on The Open Mind.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other Open Mind interviews. And check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.